Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have a great guest. He's the son of Rupert Sheldrake, who I have interviewed, a prominent scientist. This is Merlin Sheldrake. He's a biologist and a writer with a background in plant sciences, microbiology, ecology, and the history and philosophy of science. He received a Ph.D. in tropical ecology from Cambridge University for his work on underground fungal networks in tropical forests in Panama. That's where he was a predoctoral research fellow of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. So we're going to talk about Merlin's new book, which is really well written. A lot of science books can be dry or uninteresting. This one reads, at least to me, as it's just a really interesting novel. The writing is good in itself, in addition to the subject matter. So it's called Entangled Life, and it's about how fungi make our worlds and change our minds and shape our futures. They're everywhere. So Merlin, thanks for coming. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, tell me, what sparked your interest in the fungal world, and when did that happen? What's a little bit about your background?
So there are several routes into my fascination with these organisms. When I was young, I was always interested in the way that things transform. How do things change? How does a solid log become soil? How does a seed turn into a plant? How does a pile of leaves rot? I was interested in these transformations, and fungi are prodigious decomposers. And so lots of routes led me towards fungi and other microbes that decompose and rearrange the world. And also, when I got older, I became very interested in symbiosis, which is the living together, the intimate sharing of bodily space with quite unlike organisms that might be quite unrelated to each other. And so in inquiring after symbiosis, I was bumped into fungi all the time because fungi have been major players in some of the blockbuster symbioses that have shaped the planet and shaped the history of life. So that was another way in, and that's what got me started thinking about these symbiotic fungal networks that connect with tree roots and which nourish plants and which plants nourish in return. And that's what I spent most of my research career working on.
Are there plants that don't have any fungi associated with them, and or at least in lab conditions or natural conditions?
It's a good question. So there are lots of different types of fungi that associate with plants. Some live in their roots and extend outwards from their roots, lace outwards from their roots into a kind of fine mesh in the soil and help them absorb nutrients and water. There are some types of plants that don't depend on these fungi, that don't have specialized relationships with these fungi. But it's very rare that you find plants with no fungi in their roots. Some plants have no specialized relationships with these fungi, but they still have fungi in their roots that people aren't quite sure what they're doing. But there's fungi also that crowd into plants' leaves and stems, called fungal endophytes. And no plant grown in natural conditions has been found without these fungi. So really, we can think of fungi as a fundamental part of planthood. And they have really been there since the beginning, since plants migrated out of, or the ancestors of plants migrated out of fresh water and onto the land. Fungi help with that transition. And so, in fact, fungi are a more fundamental part of planthood than roots, even, certainly of leaves or wood.
Huh. How would you know that they're more fundamental than roots themselves, the leaves?
So people have done, there are fossils from around 400 million years ago. And that's after plants. So at that point, plants had roots, early types of roots. And you can see in those roots, these fungi living very much as they do today. But before that point, when algae started first moving onto the land, these were just puddles of photosynthetic tissue. They didn't have specialized structures and organs. They weren't adapted for life on land. roots are something you need if you're living on land. So in these earliest encounters, fungi, which were already on land and which are experts at exploring and digesting solid material, the ground, they behaved as these plants' root systems before these early plants evolved roots. So we know this because we know that roots didn't evolve for some time. And we know this because we're pretty sure that these fungal associations were going on before we know roots evolved.
I would think that big farming operations and farmers in general would take into account, fungi in terms of preparing the soil or, planting their plants and growing their crops. But do they? Or do they ignore it and think that they can just, if they have nutrients in the soil and plants, they're good enough?
That's a really good question. I think the clearest analogy is the way that the medical system and our medical knowledge has its relationship with microbes. So for much of the 20th century, germs or microbes were considered to be agents of disease or parasites. We would now recognize that view as dangerously narrow, as we've been able to describe these microbial communities using DNA sequencing techniques. We found that these are actually, many of them are essential partners. They guide our development, they affect our behavior, they help us digest food. Without these microbes living inside us, we wouldn't be able to do what we do or behave as we do. So having spent lots of our time trying to kill these microbes that live in and around us, we've actually done a lot to cause diseases. There's links between allergies and sterile environments, and all sorts of problems happen when people have strong courses of antibiotics that disrupt their gut microflora. So the analogy with soils is that for much of the 20th century, people have spent time trying to treating the soil as a lifeless place, as if it was a place that all that mattered was nutrients and water. And of course, this is not the case. The soil is bustling with life, and many of these microbes are essential for plant health. And so we're in a difficult situation now precisely because agricultural practices have not taken account of the life of the soil, have disrupted and actually seriously disrupted a lot of the microbial communities, fungal, bacterial, and other, that support plant growth and support food production. So there's a turn now towards incorporating microbes and microbial awareness into agricultural techniques so that we can help to undo some of the damage that we've caused.
So, would it make sense to culture certain fungi and then crop dust the field with spores, for instance? There's a number of approaches. So some people are thinking about it like that. You can buy all sorts of fungal inoculum products, and some of these may be effective in some circumstances. A lot of them may not be effective. It's a bit like the booming market for human probiotics, many of which are not, they're Z-listers in your gut, and they're being sold as probiotics, not because they're the best bacteria to put in your gut, but because they're easy to produce in manufacturing facilities. So it's a bit like that with some of these fungal inocula that you can buy to use on your plants or put on your fields. These might be species that don't respond well to those conditions, that aren't ecologically matched to that environment, and they might cause more harm than good. So there are other approaches that are more like fecal transplants. If you have it's a growing treatment in human medicine where you take fecal matter from someone with a healthy gut flora and you transplant that into someone who has a damaged or disrupted gut flora. And so by analogy, you could think about taking whole soil mixtures from healthy environments and using those to inoculate other environments. But the main idea is that not all microbes are the same, and you want to have a good match, a good fit. It's like you can't just take any type of plant and throw it anywhere and expect it to thrive. And it's a bit like that with microbes. We get into trouble when we think about them as all the same. How many different fungi are associated with, I don't know, let's say the common plants we know with wheat, or with, I guess with wheat, let's say, has that been studied or even looked at? Is there one typically for the root system? Is there another one for the leaves? And, are there any more critical than others?
Yeah, so there are more common and less common species. So So for wheat, people have looked at this, and you have some species which are able to grow in the roots of highly bred wheat varieties, but some species of fungi just can't grow in those varieties of plants because we've been selecting these varieties of plants to grow fast when we fertilize them a lot. But the plants that grow fast when you fertilize them a lot might not be the plants that are able to form well-balanced symbiotic relationships with fungi. It's not, these relationships are highly managed, intricately balanced affairs. They're not just casual things. And so some plant varieties, so a lot of our highly bred strains of wheat are actually not very good at forming high-functioning symbioses and don't fall into healthy relationships with fungi. In general, most of these root fungi called mycorrhizal fungi, they're not very specific. So you can have mycorrhizal fungi that can form relationships with lots of different types of plants, and lots of different types of plant can form relationships with different fungal strains. So both plants and fungi tend to be promiscuous, although you do have specialization in some cases.
Well, I also read that the mycorrhizal fungi tend to form you call it a wood wide web, where, let's say, trees are able to, I guess, communicate with each other through the fungal network. Is that the case?
Yes, so it is one of the really fascinating aspects of these symbioses. So because plants are promiscuous and because fungi are promiscuous, so one fungal individual can connect with multiple plants and one plant can connect with multiple fungi, it means that you can have these overlapping networks where multiple plants can be joined by a single fungus. Exactly, and so the wood wide web is the term that people have used to describe this phenomenon. And through these networks, indeed, in some cases, resources can pass between plants, like carbon-containing energy compounds, like sugars, and also other nutrients, like nitrogen and phosphorus. And as you say, signals, in some cases. They've done some amazing experiments have been done where bean plants grown either connected to each other or not connected to each other through a fungal network. And one bean plant exposed to a pest, an aphid pest. And when its connected plant, its partner plant connected through the fungus, was challenged with the aphids, it had already upregulated its defense. It had already prepared itself for attack because somehow through this shared network, it had been warned by some means, likely a chemical, but we're not totally sure what it is exactly. So yes, you can think about this as a kind of information transfer between plants, although we don't quite know how this happens or who's in control. Is it the plant in control? Is it the sender plant in control, the donor plant, or the receiver plant in control? Or is it the fungus that's in control?
Well, have there been experiments done? Let's say I have, a row of tomato plants, 20 of them in a row, and I take the leftmost one and expose it to a certain beetle or some other, attacker, an ant, and then look at the 20th one all the way in the other end of the row. 5 minutes later, can I measure an upregulation and certain defenses, et cetera, and then reverse it and see what happens? This
is exactly what people are doing right now, calling them daisy chains. So these are these daisy chained plants arranged in a relay, right? This is what we really want to know. How fast can this information travel from plant to plant to plant? And if so, how far can it travel? And can it travel between different types of plants? And if this is happening, these are all experiments in pots. What's happening in the wild busyness of an ecosystem with trees and small plants and all sorts of other organisms living? What's going on there? How is this shaping or directing the behavior of whole stands of trees? We don't know these things. It's very hard to investigate these networks in the field. So much of what we know comes from these controlled environments. But so the answer to your daisy chain question is, I don't know, because the results aren't out yet, but people are doing this experiment. We're really at the beginning of a whole new field of research here. So there are a lot of unanswered questions.
That's amazing. I mean, also another experiment would be if you had a bunch of different plants and you seeded the soil that they're all in with the mycorrhizal fungi. Is there interspecies plant communication? And if so, what's the nature of it? And how does it change competition if you have certain plants that maybe you have two plants that wouldn't normally grow well together, and maybe with the mycorrhizal fungi, they do grow better together? Or ones that work together. I don't know, it just facilitates communication. It'll be interesting to do a lot of experimentation with this.
So some of these experiments have been done, and it's interesting in some networks. So people often talk about the Wood Wide Web as some kind of utopia. And in some cases, for sure, plants benefit from being linked in a shared network. But there are other situations with different types of mycorrhizal fungus where it actually doesn't benefit plants to be linked in a shared mycorrhizal network, because exactly as you say, these fungi can modulate the competition between plants. So you can have a situation where a small plant connected to a big plant by a fungus is actually losing out by being connected, because the big plant sucks a bigger proportion of the nutrients out of the network, more than its fair share, if you want to use those terms. But the small plant actually starts doing better if you sever its connection to the network, because then it doesn't have to compete with this big plant. So these networks can amplify competition as well as amplify cooperation.
Oh, it's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It's really amazing. I guess a tip for anyone gardening at home, can you go to the store or the gardening store and get mycorrhizal fungi? Do they come in solid form or liquid form, and can you add them to the soil to make your garden work better?
Yeah, you can go and buy them from garden centers. Whether they're going to do much good, I think some would probably be helpful and some might not be, but it's an unregulated industry and there are few industry standards, so it's very hard to know. If you were at home and you wanted to find out, then the best thing to do would be to do your own experiment. Get your geraniums or whatever you're growing, or maybe something you're growing from seed, and do an experiment. Have some parts that you add your store-bought inoculum to, and some parts you don't, and see which do better. And then you can find out for yourself. But there's not all these products are going to work as well as the others. One thing that you can do to support microbial communities in the soil is to make sure there's lots of organic matter, using compost, not using inorganic fertilizers. If you use inorganic fertilizers, this like pellets and chemical fertilizers, you're not contributing to the structure of the soil, not contributing to the because to live in the soil, microbes need a place to live, and so soil structure is important. Organic material turning over, all of this is something you need. So you can look after the health of the soil by reducing inorganic fertilizers and increasing the amount of organic material adding.
So what? I don't know. Maybe it's a chicken and egg problem, but how would you rejuvenate dead soil? Let's say a field that had monoculture and it was exhausted. Do you think with what you'd be able to rejuvenate the field more effectively? Would you go in with organic matter and mycorrhizal, liquids or whatever it is, or spores, and you think you could regenerate a field more effectively than what's currently done?
Well, I don't know about me personally. I think there are lots of people who could regenerate those fields better than others. And I think the people who would be best at doing that would be people who took a microbial point of view. And you could do that in a number of ways. Some people would come and add a lot of, or some people add a kind of biochar. Some people would add compost. Some people would use kind of compost teas, which are liquid microbial inocular, kind of fermented organic matter, which you can add to the soil, which rejuvenates, which re-inoculates with microbes. And so you can have this bustling microbial community again. And so by dead soil means dead because there's nothing living in it, and most of what lives in the soil is microbial. And so the first thing to do to restore dead soil would be to pay attention to microbes. And there are lots of ways to do that, as they say.
Yeah, are microbes more important than fungi, or are fungi more important than microbes, or that's a meaningless question?
Microbe is a kind of general term. It just means microscopic organism. And so fungi are an interesting case because in one sense they're a microbe because they have microscopic spores, and yeasts are a microbe because they're microscopic. But lots of fungi grow into these networks which are in some sense microscopic because their cells are very thin. But then again, you can have very big fungi. In fact, the largest organism in the world is the fungal network in Oregon. And mushrooms, the fruiting bodies of these fungal networks, those certainly aren't microbes because you can see them and hold them. So fungi have this funny, ambiguous status, but microbe is not really a technical term. So I tend to think of fungi as as microbes, but with this caveat that they're often not microscopic. It's a kind of paradox. But fungi are potent decomposers, so they'll be they'll be in the soil. They'll be turning over nutrients. They'll be spinning these organic and inorganic nutrient cycles. They'll be doing all sorts of crucial metabolic work in these soil ecosystems, which you would associate with microbes.
What are some of the other roles of fungi that you've learned about that are just amazing and probably not commonly known?
Gosh, there are so many things. So, I mean, there's one of the amazing and little known aspects is the relationships that fungi form, which produce lichens. And lichens are organisms that many people would have seen, but probably wouldn't have thought twice about. These are these organisms that you see growing on roofs or fence posts or cliffs or high tide lines on beaches. And they're a mixture, they're a symbiotic organism. They're a composite organism made up of a fungus and a photosynthetic partner, which can either be an alga or photosynthetic bacteria. And actually, they're a composite of many more organisms, usually, as well. So they're a symbiotic organism. And they can grow on the most exposed and weather-beaten surfaces. When a new volcanic island is thrown up in the middle of the Pacific, the first things to colonize the rock are lichens, because they can obtain their nutrition by the fungus can use these acids and pressure to digest solid rock, and the photosynthetic partner can eat light and carbon dioxide and produce energy that way. So they're a self-contained ecosystem, and they can live in these astonishingly barren surfaces. Some of the bleakest places in the world, the Antarctic dry valleys, which are used to simulate conditions on Mars because they're so scorched by UV, incredibly dry, temperature fluctuations. But lichens thrive in these environments. And because of this, these fungi play a really important role in the biogeochemical cycles of the planet, because it's out of rocks that we get minerals becoming soil. So these lichens are kind of the go-betweens between the dead rock and soils full of life and organic matter. So that's one example of how fungi and fungal relationships can play a part in these bigger cycles, which you don't tend to think about, but which are enormously important. And then there's the decomposition is another, just straightforward decomposition. We don't think much about this at all, but if we could pause decomposition, then bodies, plant bodies, trees would pile up kilometers deep. We live in the space that decomposition leaves behind, and fungi are the most prodigious decomposers, and they return through their decomposition. They return, I think, 85 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere every year. We return about 10. So they're a major force in the nutrient cycles of the world. So that's the thing. We a lot of the time we don't see what they do, because what they do is so essential and so staple to the functioning of ecosystems that we just take it for granted.
I've heard that they're present in, I guess, the absolute harshest environments on Earth, like the Chernobyl reactor. I heard there's like a fungus growing on the wall in the most radioactive part that produces melanin that's like a pigment in skin that thrives there.
Yeah, exactly. And these are really interesting fungi because they appear to be able to use radiation as a source of energy, a bit like plants use it and can capture the energy in sunlight. Radiosynthesis. It's a little unclear quite how this happens, but it seems that melanins are a key part of both their ability to survive in these environments and their ability to capture and harness this energy. But yeah, it's astonishing. I mean, the blasted reactor at Chernobyl is a hotbed of these fungi who seem to be able to not just survive, but they grow towards radioactive hot particles. They seek out radiation. It's amazing.
I guess there's nothing that can't be decomposed in the right environment or the right decomposer.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. The right fungus in the right place. I mean, it is an entire kingdom of life, and there are lots of ways to be a fungus. But for sure, within the fungal kingdom, the metabolic abilities are just amazing, and we don't even know half of it. We're really just beginning.
In your book, you said like I think 94% of all the fungi in the world are undiscovered. How is that estimate made? And if we wanted to look, where would we look to find more of them?
It's a good question. So species estimates are really hard to make, and especially because fungi are really hard to divide into clear species. So that's a rough estimate based on how many species based on species accumulation curves. It's called how many species you find as you increase your sampling area. So you extrapolate from that, and you can estimate how many we don't know about. But in reality, it's very hard to call a fungus a species at all. Some mushroom-producing fungi, for example, there's a mushroom, it looks like that kind of mushroom. It's identifiable as a chanterelle or a porcini. Much easier, but still within those recognizable species, there are lots of subtypes and hybrids that we still don't have a good handle on. And then there are lots of fungi that just don't produce visible fruiting bodies at all. And for these fungi, we can explore that world through DNA sequencing, which is how we know about them. But then it presents a whole load of problems because you end up with all these unique genetic signatures, no way to assign them to an existing taxonomic group. So the taxonomic system that we live within was devised for animals and plants, and it's has a very hard time coping with fungi or bacteria. So if you wanted to find more, as you asked, then we would look both in places that people hadn't looked, and looking means sequencing DNA. It also means trying to culture the fungi. If you grow them put them on a plate with nutrients, do they grow? And if they grow, can you separate this one from that one and grow them separately? That's very laborious, and lots of fungi can't be cultured. So looking basically means DNA sequencing. And you'd look in places that people hadn't looked, but you'd also look in places that people had looked. And a lot of the time you'd find new fungi that hadn't been described because people weren't looking for them, or because people were looking for a particular sort of fungi and not looking with a big, wide net, a broad net. So you can, there are lots of possibilities. One of the interesting things, I think, is to look in really extreme environments, as you point out with the Chernobyl fungi. I think this is where we can find fungi with astonishing abilities. And a group working in Pakistan found the plastic degrading fungus by sequencing and culturing the fungi that they isolated from rubbish dumps. So I think by looking in places that of potential interest, we might find those fungi that we might be able to apply, or in some sort of situation.
In the human body, I've heard a few scientists talk about the microbiome instead of the microbiome. So what role do we understand that fungi play in the human body?
So on the whole, so it's starting very broad. On the broadest level, animals, and humans included, tend to have more intimate relationships with bacteria than fungi. And also our biggest killers, our biggest and most deadly pathogens are also bacteria. Plants tend to have more stable relationships with fungi, and their biggest killers are also fungi. So there's this nice, interesting continuity between partners and killers, and these spectrums are not always clear-cut at all. So in our gut, we have lots of bacteria and archaea. We have some fungi, but most of the fungi on our bodies are on our surfaces, our orifices. So yeast and they play a really important role as kind of gatekeepers. And the fungi in our gut are much less studied than the bacteria in our gut. They do exist, but on the whole, in the human body, we're dealing with superficial fungi and usually yeast. I mean, there are some quite interesting cases where people have been found with fungi growing inside their brains, and you can have some types of yeast which infect your brain and produce all sorts of horrible symptoms. So things can go wrong, but it's not like we have a mycorrhizal type relationship. We don't have a tight partnership with a network-forming fungus that we can't live without.
Yeah, I've heard of like a foot fungus. I've heard of, you're right, funguses on surfaces of people, but I guess in our guts and internally. I mean, I've heard that, women have gotten yeast infections. And, I'm not sure about internally what the role is. But there are a bunch of scientists, I would think, that are studying the microbiome, right? For instance, yeast infections and people getting toe fungus and things like that. But I would also think that there are people studying the internal fungi in us. I would think there are some, and I guess that would be called the microbiome, right?
Exactly, the microbiome, yeah. The microbiome would refer also to those that live outside us too. I haven't heard of any fungi that live inside us playing major roles. Not that it means they aren't there. We know so little about who does what. It's very easy to describe these microbial communities with sequencing. It's very hard to work out what they're doing. So we have lots of descriptions. It's a bit like in the 18th century when people were going around collecting specimens from all over the world. And it's a period of description and collection, less dealing with the questions of what's doing what and how are they doing it. We're kind of at that stage in microbial sciences.
So,
I mean, there are people studying function too, but on the whole, function is it in your complex community in your gut to work out who is doing what, when, and how. These are not easy things to tease apart because by nature of experiments, you have to isolate variables. But once you've isolated the microbe, you're in an artificial situation and it's not in the community that would be in your gut. So how do you then work out what it's doing in your gut?
So fungi seem to work with plants quite closely. What about with bacteria? Do fungi have an adversarial relationship, or do they have a mutualistic relationship with bacteria in the context of plants or in the context of other environments?
Yeah, I mean, so fungi have microbiomes too. They have bacteria that live in and on them. And just like us, a fungi being more closely related to animals than plants. So some of these bacteria flowing within fungal networks, they move around. Bacteria use fungal networks like highways to travel through the soil. But lots of the time, they play key roles. And so fungi wouldn't be able to survive in certain environments or to strike up relationships with certain plants unless they have that key bacterial symbiote. And if you cure fungi of these bacterial symbiotes, you often find a loss of function in that fungus, just as if you cure a human of their microbial symbionts. Of course, there are, just as if you have bacterial symbionts, you also have bacterial diseases because there's this fluid relationship between helpful and harmful relationships. So there are also, fungi have key relationships with the virus and viruses. There was a great study where there's a grass that grows in tropical hot soils. And if you grow the grass without the fungus, it can't survive in the hot soil. And if you grow the grass with the fungus, but you've cured the fungus of the virus, then the plant can't grow in the soil. So the plant needs the fungus, but it needs the fungus with a virus living inside it in order to survive. And these situations are not at all uncommon, these nested relationships. So this world of the fungal microbiomes, the bacterial and fungal relationships, this is really fascinating and a fast-growing field. And we don't know as much as we should, but more and more is being found out. But yeah, it's a very exciting world because lots of what we think of as fungal traits, and this can be quite important if you have some industry or application. If you're growing a fungus for some purpose and you want to improve or to change its behavior, a lot of the time you need to think about the bacteria that it's relating with. And a lot of the time you can achieve what you want to do by thinking about its partner bacteria.
So fungi have viruses that infect them as well?
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah. I mean, fungi produce lots of...
Imagine a parasite that was infected by a fungus with bacteria in it, and then a virus was in that, and then the parasite infected a person. It's weird. You can have, like you said, layers and layers and layers of stuff.
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it? This is how life works. There are viruses that have viruses living inside them. There's bacteria that host bacteria. Bacteria themselves host viruses. And there's this great situation I read about recently where you have an insect, a mealybug, that has a bacteria living inside its cells. But inside those bacteria are other bacteria living inside the cells. And each of the insect, the bacteria, and the other bacteria, all living like Russian dolls, all of them depend on each other to complete certain key parts of their metabolic life cycle. So you have this interdependence on multiple scales. It really stretches your mind, but this is the story of life.
Yeah, that is. That's amazing. Huh. It makes it hard to be reductionist if you are reductionist, like a lot of what medicine is, it just tells me that you're really not going to understand what's going on. But then again, how do you contemplate what's going on if some of these are so complicated, these interplays, these networks? Like, how do you culture a bacteria to study it if its behavior is meaningless or changed by its lack of context, and interaction?
I think you've hit it exactly on the nail on the head. This is one of the most mind-bending and worldview shifting aspects of these relationships. And it changed the way we think about how we know, like how do we investigate? Like how do we know that this works like that if we've chopped it into a tiny piece and looked at its behavior in an artificial situation? Do we know any more about what it's doing in its natural environment or not? And so I think it challenges us to ask questions about reductive approaches. And it challenges us to ask questions about what we mean by individuals. What do we mean by cells, biological cells, and what do we mean by autonomy and independence and all these other really major concepts that we take for granted in human life, but actually which are far from clear-cut in the biological world.
So what is your role in all of this? Is it, elucidation of what's actually going on so that scientists can study it properly? I mean, what role are you playing? What role do you want to play?
So my research focuses on mycorrhizal fungi and their relationships with plants. That's where I've done and I'm doing my active research. The book is a book about fungi in general, and it's a communication project to think about these organisms in a bigger picture kind of way, which is a different kind of exercise from doing research, conventional research, where one's focused on quite precise questions and dealing with them in quite methodical ways. So it's been fun to write the book and to think broadly, to range broadly across the fungal kingdom and in different aspects of human relationships with fungi. But as I say, most of my research focuses on the relationships between plants and their root fungi.
In your research, are there any other life forms that we're missing? I mean, this would be a big discovery, but fungi, yeast, plants, animals, bacteria, viruses. Is there anything else that I don't know is being examined that may be a new form of life, a whole new class of life, or no?
Yes. So I think there are two things that come to mind. One is archaea, which is they're not bacteria. They were thought of as bacteria for a long time, but actually they're a distinct kingdom, a distinct domain of life even. And we know very little about them, but they're really important, and they're in loads of places, and they do loads of hidden things, just like fungi and bacteria do. So archaea are one area which is understudied and is opening up new questions and new understandings. And another which is fascinating is the infraterrestrials, the so-called infraterrestrials that live deep inside below the surface of the earth, kilometers deep in the crust of the earth, under enormous temperatures and pressures. When people are discovering these now, researchers using very deep drilling cores deep into the earth to study the carbon storage deep in the earth. It's called the Deep Carbon Observatory. But what's turning out to be the case is that there are thriving, rich communities of microbes living deep inside the earth under astonishingly intense conditions, some of them thousands of years old, growing very slowly, what we'd call extremophiles, lovers of extremes. But this is a whole new type of habitat, a whole new world of different types of habitat. And it's just now becoming started to be studied. So I think that's a really interesting place to think about life happening, because on the whole, people have not thought about life taking place deep under the, in the crust of the earth.
Yeah, no, that's true. Well, very good, Merlin. What's the best way for people to find your book? Is it widely published yet, and in what forms will it be, and where is it?
Yes, so it's published on 12th. It's published on Tuesday, 12th of May, and it's available from all major retailers. If you want to support indie booksellers, then you can go to bookshop.org. And otherwise, it's available audiobook or ebook or physical book, wherever you would normally buy your books.
Okay. Well, very good. And where can people find out more about you specifically and get in contact if they have questions?
The best thing to do is to go to my website, which is merlinsheldrake.com.
Okay, very good. Well, Merlin, thanks for coming. This is, literally a whole new world that most people don't see. So thanks for shedding light on it. And it's been a good talk.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.